switch. So I would like to use this few minutes just to do the introductions, and then as soon as we have the switch, we will go ahead. I know that all of you have tried to keep time, and we don't want to delay us further. So I begin, especially for the individuals online and some of you who have come, I would like to welcome you most warmly. I'm Edward, I'm Professor Edward Chirumira, I'm the director for STIAS. I also just came back yesterday from a wonderful break, seeing my 94-year-old mother, and so I'm all energized and very eager to listen to Linda. So Linda will have an issue with my mom because I told her I was leaving because I wanted to attend the public lecture. And I know that the number of fellows that came during my absence, you've been wonderfully introduced by my colleague, Dr. Christoph Poe, the Senior Program Manager, who will also be in charge of the question and answers session when it comes to that. And so again, I extend warm welcome to you that joined in the last 2 weeks. I do welcome also the colleagues online, and it's always a pleasure to have you and to have these public lectures that provide us an opportunity as STIAS to also showcase what we have at STIAS with regard to the fellows. And so we have 3 public lectures in the semester, and we kind of try to choose them to represent the richness of the program at STIAS. So welcome, and again, thank you, Linda, for being one of those that are put on the stage to demonstrate to the public that we do have something happening at STIAS. As usual, what we do have with public lectures is that we ask a colleague, either from Stellenbosch University or from around, and usually individuals that are working in the area within which the public lecture speaker works, to introduce our fellows. And we're really pleased that Linda is going to be introduced by Professor Leslie Swart here in front. Professor Leslie Swart is a clinical psychologist by training and obtained his PhD in psychology at the University. Okay. I think now we're ready to go. Fortunately, the switch does not switch Leslie. So he's still going to introduce Linda. And as I said, he's a clinical psychologist by training, obtained his PhD in psychology at the University of Cape Town. And he holds a second PhD in English Studies, Creative Writing from Stellenbosch University. He joined the Department of Psychology at Stellenbosch University as a professor in 2001, having jumped ship from Cape Town. In addition to being employed at Stellenbosch University, Leslie is a visiting professor in psychology at the University of Johannesburg, and also a global advisor to the Institute for Culture and Society at the University of Western Sydney in Australia. His work focuses on disability rights and access and on mental health issues with a focus on sub-Saharan Africa. And many of his research projects are conducted in partnership with disability rights and service organizations. He's received a number of awards for his work, including the Academy of Sciences of South Africa Gold Medal for Science for Society in 2019. So he's going to introduce our speaker this afternoon, and I would like to ask Leslie to come and introduce Linda. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, and thank you for asking me to do this introduction. I feel very bad because Linda specifically asked me not to mention all her qualifications and her awards, and I took her seriously, and now you've mentioned some of mine. So I do have this rather long CV of Linda, so I'll just start reading from the beginning. She asked me to do something more informal. And in fact, I left my prop. I need this prop. So Linda's going to be talking about the Birth to 30 study, and I believe there's some copies of this book available today. This is a remarkable book. And so when I'd looked at this book, I asked some questions, actually. How do you tell the story of an ongoing research project covering more than 30 years and counting in an accessible and an interesting way? How do you locate the stories of the researchers themselves in this bigger story? How do you honor the lives and the stories of the research participants and of the people collecting data? While you're doing all of this, how do you keep your audience awake while you're talking about some quite technical things at quite some length with statistics, tables, and so on? How do you make this book accessible to those who contributed to the research as investigators, participants, stakeholders, and data collectors? Now, if you want to know the answers to these questions, all you have to do is read the book by Linda, who's our speaker today, or to listen to this talk, and it's going to be a real treat. So this book, and I imagine that the talk, is a story about lots of things. It's about Linda herself. It's a story about science globally and in South Africa. And it's a story about 3 generations, I'm not sure if they're 4 yet, but almost 4, living in the complex environment of South Africa's economic heartland. What's really wonderful about the book, and this goes for all of Linda's work, first and foremost, is it's accessible, and it's even got quite a racy style. I don't want to trivialize in any way the intellectual contribution of the book and of the hundreds of supporting publications in top journals, even though my envy is on show. I want to tell you that somebody who really enjoys reading fiction and memoir, I just loved reading this book. It was no chore to read it. I had to do it for this meeting, but I loved doing it. So, and it's not the case, as Marina Hubert, who works in science communication at Stellenbosch, sometimes says, Linda's not dumbing down. What she's doing is she's clearing up the science. So in some ways, this book, and I really feel this quite strongly, this book is a love story. I'm not sure if, in this case, the love object is science, whether it's a research project, whether it's South Africa, and specifically South Africa's children. But whatever it is, it's in a book. It's a book in which we see the positive effects of libido as used in the Jungian sense, as, quote, psychic energy, desire, will, interest, and passion. The book's also, it's not just a love story, so it's not just chick lit, sorry to be so gendered, but it's also a thriller, because we want to know what's going to happen to these children as life unfolds. It's also a kind of a palimpsest, which, I mean, I found this absolutely fascinating, is that there's kind of layer upon layer of the intimately personal, the environmental, the often brutal and violent social, and they come in and out of focus. But as you look at each layer, you have the other layers present. And I think the book achieves something that individual academic articles can't do on their own. I don't quite know how Linda manages it, but she does. Now, to talk a little bit personally about Linda, probably the most formative years of my academic life were those I spent in a unit led by Linda at the HSRC nearly 20 years ago. When I got there, I'd been quite a reasonably successful psychology academic. I was chugging along quite happily in a rather small and insular academic world. What Linda did for me, and she didn't do this just for me, was, I'm not quite sure what the right metaphor is. In one way, she threw open the windows and let the fresh air in. This was quite difficult for me, she rattled the cage of me and other people's, of our culturally encapsulated world in which psychologists speak to other psychologists, and it's everybody else's problem that they don't understand us. I'm enormously proud that Linda, as an exceptional and multiple award-winning scientist, is a psychologist through and through. I mean, thank you for everything you do for our profession. Linda takes psychology and developmental psychology and its methods very seriously, and she's rigorous about our discipline. But one of the important things that Linda showed me was that in order to be a rigorous psychologist, you have to engage with the big world out there. So Linda's worked fruitfully and happily, and it's all to be found in her work and in this book, with neuroscientists, with epidemiologists, statisticians, pediatricians, economists, gender activists, biologists, ethicists, policymakers in government and in global organizations and agencies, NGOs, anthropologists, and even with photographers and artists, and the list, I'm sure that's not an exhaustive list, it goes on and on. And something about Linda is that she's not afraid to tackle big questions. She's not afraid that some of the questions she asks don't have clear answers. She knows how to formulate new and interesting problems and to chip systematically away at existing ones. All of this she does, and you will see this today, with a love of the work, with an engagement with communities and community building, and from an identity as an engaged South African who cares. Linda's mentored many, many people at all sorts of levels, and I'm lucky to count myself as one of those that she has mentored, and she's helped build the careers and change the working lives of many, including me. So thank you, Linda, for asking me to introduce you. You asked me not to list your achievements, so I haven't, but I hope I've given people a sense of what you've done and continue to do for scholarship and for people. So I'm pleased to welcome Linda.
Thank you very much, Leslie. I knew we were of one mind about a lot of things, but about the love really struck me. I recently gave a seminar to Pumla Gaboda Madihizela's postgraduate students, and I said to them, it's about love. And truly it is. So thank you very much, Leslie. I feel I didn't deserve it, but it was wonderful to listen to it. I'd also like to thank STIAS. This is the most extraordinary opportunity of my life, and I've said to Edward they're going to have to boot me out in December because I'm not going to leave of my free will. Online is my long-term colleague and dear friend Shane Norris, so I have to acknowledge him and thank him, for he is the person that has made this study possible over its 33 years. And I'd also like to thank my long-term collaborator and dear friend Sarah Nike, who's here today with me from Durban, our Durban office. Thank you for coming. Thank you to the people online for your interest in this work. I really appreciate it. So for 33 years, we have studied more than 3,000 children and their families born in 1990 in the municipal areas of Soweto, Johannesburg. We've collected their biological, their psychological, their educational data in 24 waves, almost every year, and sometimes twice a year. We've assessed the mothers in the first generation, the participants in the cohort in the second generation, and now the children born to the participants as the third generation, and Leslie's right, a fourth generation is probably already been born. We have interviewed and measured mothers, children, fathers, teachers, schools. Our digital files contain more than 22 million raw data points, that's not counting the things we convert into, 2 books, more than 300 scientific publications, 50 postgraduate students have written their theses on this. Now, the project has been the flagship of the Developmental Pathways to Health Research Unit at Wits University, directed by Shane Norris, who's online. We have a large staff. We occupy a 3-story building on the grounds of the Chris Hani Baragwanath Hospital. We use motorbikes, vehicles, a mobile laboratory to reach participants who can't come to us. We have a fully accredited physiology lab, minus 70-degree freezers to store plasma, urine, and serum. We have a DEXA machine to measure body composition and bone density. We have an ultrasound machine and a P-pod for infant measurements. I talk about we. So who is we? We refers to Shane and I, Lisa Mickelsfield, and many other senior scholars, both here in South Africa and abroad, and their collaborators and their graduate students. And of course, our very dedicated, amazing research team. 2 of our staff have celebrated more than 30 years on the staff, and many have gone past the mark of 20 years. One is now the physiology technician who does all the technical measurements, and the other, Meiki Matabani, is really the center of the study, visiting participants between rounds, keeping everybody in contact, and making the whole study feel as a family. So, with somewhat of a rueful smile, I say we continue to be a study as ambitious as the country we wanted to create. Together, we have grown and variously stumbled and succeeded in the cauldron of change, politics, miracles, and misadventures that make our country such an amazing place to live in and to visit. Undoubtedly, the study of the same group of children and their families over the first 30 years of their lives is exceptional, especially in our context. Very long-term studies of people are rare, even more so birth cohort studies. A birth cohort being the study of a group of children born within a time and place parameter. Now, some remarkable birth cohort studies exist, many of them retrospective or historical in design, starting at some point in adulthood or old age and tracking back through records to determine health and well-being at an earlier age. For example, by going back to original birth records of 15,000 men and women in east of England, the Hertfordshire study showed that by 75 years of age, people born between 1911 and 1930, if they were born of low birth weight, had a significantly higher risk of cardiovascular disease and death in adulthood. Some cohorts have studied people living through exceptional and extraordinary times, such as the hunger winter, the famine in the Netherlands between 1944 and 1945. This so-called natural experiment showed how undernutrition during a specific period in pregnancy affected subsequently born children. One finding from the study was of increased risks of schizophrenia amongst children conceived during the famine. This association was later supported and replicated in studies of the Chinese famine of 1959-1961. Some of the most influential are the British birth cohort studies, which began in 1946, in part to look at declining fertility rates in Britain, and also whether the revised obstetric and midwifery services had started to help prevent the very high rates of infant mortality. These children are now in their 70s. 12 years after the 46th birth cohort was initiated, another one was started in 1958 and a third in 1970. A fourth was established in 1991, and a fifth, the Millennium Birth Cohort, began at the turn of the century. Through these birth cohorts, some 70,000 people from all over the United Kingdom, some still young and now others very old, have been and continue to be studied from birth to death. A new British cohort has just recently been launched called the Children of the 2020s, which recruited a nationally representative sample of children at 9 months of age for follow-up to adulthood. Now, I've long felt the responsibility to tell the story of birth to 30, mainly because I'm the only person among the group that initiated the study in the late 1980s, when we planned and conducted pilot studies, who's still actively involved in the project. As such, I'm the only person who brings together the past and the present in so-called institutional memory. The BT30 children were born as the detested apartheid regime crumbled and a rainbow nation was born. Nelson Mandela, our first president of democratic South Africa, became the unwitting but beloved patron of the study. Just 6 weeks after the first BT30 baby was born on April the 23rd, 1990, Mandela was released after 27 years in prison on February the 11th, leading to the cohort and the first book on the study being called Mandela's Children. Now, birth to 30 mirrors our apartheid past. It was prompted by dramatic impending changes in our society and has been shaped by subsequent developments. In 2021, I published the book that Leslie was referring to, in which I described the stories, people, and science of birth to 30. Thanks to generous funding from the Oppenheimer Memorial Trust, we've been able to give free copies of the book to every participant in the study, and there are some remaining free copies outside, and please feel free to take one. So in this lecture, I'm going to expand on three aspects of the study: how it emerged out of and is shaped by South Africa's past and present, what the main scientific contribution of the study has been to date, and what we have learnt about why and how at least this group of people have or haven't changed in the 3 decades since 1990. So why and how did the study come about? It emerged out of a confluence of threats and opportunity in the political, academic, and policy domain. In the political domain, the aims of the pass and influx control laws were to control the number of Africans living in white South Africa by moving them into Bantustans and homelands, and ensuring that the workers needed in towns and cities were migrants and not citizens. With low rates of urbanization and higher population growth than among whites, the abolition of these laws in the late 1980s was feared would lead to large numbers of Africans migrating into urban areas in search of work and better living conditions. All ministers in President P.W. Botha's cabinet would have reached into their bureaucracies for information and ideas, including the South African Medical Research Council president. A progressive group of MRC researchers were ready with a memorandum on the health of urban Africans, which laid the foundation for an urbanization program in the MRC, including the proposal to start a birth cohort study. In the academic domain, the political contingencies created opportunities for scholars interested in secular changes in health and well-being with urbanization. The stature of black children, for example, was predicted to increase under improved socioeconomic conditions, which was a good thing. But so was population weight, with higher caloric intakes and lower physical activity, potentially a bad thing that could herald overweight and obesity and its health-related problems. In the policy domain, increased urbanization with associated demographic, nutrition, and health transitions would put new demands on housing, infrastructure, health and social services. As infectious diseases of young children decreased with improved household resources and infrastructure for water and sanitation, chronic diseases and social disorders would likely increase. Housing and infrastructure were hopelessly inadequate for the number of urban migrants who moved into towns, and still is. The first AIDS case was identified in 1982, and South Africa fast became and remains the epicenter of the HIV epidemic globally. Increased social and lifestyle problems herald the combined threats of both infectious and chronic diseases. So who was enrolled in the study and why? Three things strongly influenced enrollment. The one was apartheid population groups and the way services were provided. There was violent resistance to the apartheid conditions, and mobility, which was then and remains a coping strategy for families. So recruiting pregnant women meant finding them through health services. At the time, these were separated along racial lines. In 1990, roughly 3/4 of the South African population were black African, 12% were whites, 10% so-called coloureds, and 3% Indian. While the majority of black and coloured people used the public health services in the area, almost all white and some Indian families were using private health care, receiving all their antenatal, birth, and postnatal services through a dispersed network of obstetricians, midwives, and clinics. Without the funds for extensive and likely not very successful outreach into the private sector, the study under-enrolled white families and children. Following extensive discussions with UK-based cohort leaders, we decided that of real interest were the variations in outcomes amongst the majority of the population, mainly black and coloured children and their families who were using public services. We later deeply regretted this decision and attempted twice at 5 and 10 years of age to refresh and supplement the group of white children and families. As experienced by the census and many household surveys, white families have little incentive to participate and are cautious about admitting strangers onto their properties and into their homes for interviews. Obvious to us now, though, the greatest disadvantage of not recruiting a representative sample of middle and upper middle class families is the limited range of socioeconomic conditions that has led to us underestimating the impacts of poverty. There were also violent resistance to apartheid conditions. We undertook pilot studies in 1989 to ensure that we could enroll close to 3,000 births in a 6-week period in April 1990, starting in pregnancy. However, a 10-day strike by hospital workers at the beginning of May 1990 disrupted our schedule. Though the strike at 18 hospitals in the area led to the recognition of the National Health and Allied Workers Union, as well as agreement to a number of workers' demands, pregnant women were first forced to seek health care from unaffected services. We had to extend our enrolment period, resulting in only 60% of the women about whom we had antenatal information actually delivering within our study window, which was an enormous loss of data. Violence by the apartheid government and against it, as well as competing political groups, rising criminality, increasing service delivery protests, and community and household violence has been a major theme in Birth to 30. 3 years into the study, one of our staff members was raped and killed in the community. By age 18, only 1% of the cohort had not witnessed or experienced violence. Close to half had witnessed violence in their home, with adolescence being a peak period for young people to experience or witness violence. I said mobility is used as a coping strategy by many families. Our pilot studies indicated that about 20% of women who delivered a baby in the designated area could not be traced 12 months later, and by all inquiries had left the area to return to their homes elsewhere. When we conducted a comprehensive search for families and children at 3 years of age, it was clear that a further 20% could not be found, and that the major reason that the child and sometimes the mother had returned to a peri-urban or rural home was that they wanted to ensure that the child's birth was recorded in the area according to the influx control law, which provided justification that they could seek work in Soweto when they became adults. Some birth to 30 children have experienced very high rates of mobility, moving homes and schools as families seek better or cheaper options for accommodation, for their care and their education. We have tracked children's movements from several perspectives: their residential moves, the composition of their households, the consistency of their contact with their parents, and moves between schools. Movement is highest amongst the youngest children, something found in other studies in this country, frequently in a circular pattern between rural and urban households, and schooling starts to stabilize the residency of young children. Indicative of how parents attempt to find the best options for their children is that only 18% of children attended their nearest public school. More than a third of children travelled more than 3 kilometres one way to and from school each day, and 60% of children attended a school in another suburb. We concluded that families make substantial investments in travel, fees, and related costs to access what they consider to be a better quality education for their children. So, having set that up, what have been the main scientific contribution of the study to date? Over the 3 decades of the study, Birth to 30 findings from cross-sectional and longitudinal analyses have contributed to our knowledge on a topic and or have been taken up by policymakers in one way or another. And I'll give you 3 examples. We have found significant associations between blood lead levels measured in umbilical cord blood at birth with behaviour problems, aggression and violence in adolescents, particularly among boys. The association is somewhat weakened because boys are more vulnerable to lead exposure and they have higher blood lead levels than girls. They're also more aggressive. Among girls, we found that high blood lead levels delayed the onset of puberty. Now, blood lead levels are generally much higher in low and middle income countries, and the consequences therefore much more severe. For example, South Africa had amongst the highest levels of lead in petrol that had ever been used anywhere in the world until it started being phased out in 2006 when the cohort was 16 years old. Another source of lead exposure for children in South Africa is paint, which is used in homes and on playground equipment. Legislative controls were promulgated in 2009, but compliance is uncertain. So that's one example. Another example is that we continue to trace the links between maternal depression, early poor child growth and behavior problems, and adolescent and adult anxiety and depression. Perinatal depression occurring between pregnancy and the end of a child's first year of life is much more prevalent in low and middle income countries, being associated with higher rates of stressful conditions such as poverty and conflict. A global review reports on an average prevalence of 17% of perinatal depression, with the highest rate, 40%, in Southern Africa. Our data show the long-run effects of maternal depression on children into adulthood, presumably operating through genetic factors and parental behavior, including preoccupation and emotional withdrawal. Third, we have monitored weight gain and obesity among mothers and children in light of its rapidly increasing prevalence globally and its correlation with chronic conditions such as diabetes and cardiovascular disease. Close to half of all mothers of birth to 30 children were obese by the age of 41. Overweight manifests early amongst their children and tracks into adulthood, being associated with declining physical activity and increased consumption of foods rich in refined fats and carbohydrates. And some of you might remember the Madam and Eve cartoon series on what we described in Birth to 30 as the quarter, a lunch break snack containing more than half of all daily energy requirements for a 17-year-old. From 2008 to 2013, the global prevalence of overweight and obesity among children 2 to 19 years increased by 47%. As reported in other studies, we find a markedly different developmental pattern between boys and girls. While body mass index increases with age amongst both sexes, by 13 to 15 years of age, the prevalence of overweight amongst girls is twice that of boys. By 16 to 18 years, it is 3 times that of boys. And especially so for obesity and for central obesity, which is waist circumference. Overweight and obese women experience a range of health challenges, including reproductive issues such as infertility, miscarriage, hypertension, gestational diabetes, and so on, contributing significantly to the human and social costs of excessive weight gain. However, undoubtedly, the most significant findings from Birth to 30 revolve around what we call the developmental origins of health and disease, and especially the significance of the first 1,000 days of life. But the impact of our papers on this topic was not achieved by Birth to 30 alone. Instead, we work in a consortium of 5 studies, the only birth cohort studies to adulthood in low and middle income countries. Cohorts consist of sites in Brazil, Guatemala, India, the Philippines, and South Africa, all of which measured nutrition, health, and growth, and barring India, social and psychological development longitudinally. The combined sample size of cohorts is about 23,000 pregnant women and their children, and approximately 11,000 births with data into adulthood. The first 1,000 days of life, which includes gestation and the first 2 years postnatal, is an extremely impressionable or plastic period in human development. During this time, exposures and experiences can have short and long-lasting effects on health and well-being through epigenetics and other factors. The structure and function of organs and their physiology are laid down during fetal life. Billions of neurons are formed during the second trimester of pregnancy. In fact, all the neurons we have for the rest of our life. Synaptic connections boom in the last 3 months of pregnancy and the first 6 months after birth, being gradually subjected to strengthening and pruning in response to environmental stimuli and what is assumed to be a use it or lose it principle. The importance of this period was highlighted in our first cohort paper, which was published in The Lancet in 2008. We referred to it simply as pregnancy in the first 2 years of life. Hillary Clinton, in a speech given in 2010, was probably the first person to use the words 1,000 days at a public event when launching a foundation of the same name. This catchy, additive title, easy to remember, has significantly advanced advocacy for the importance of this period of life. And I think it shows the brilliance of marketers when they apply their minds to science. In this first of many cohorts papers, we reviewed and analysed associations between maternal and child nutrition with adult human capital measures later in life, as well as the risk of chronic diseases. The prevalence, patterning, and severity of exposures and outcomes vary between high and low resource environments, and ours was the first of such studies in contexts other than the global north. We examined these indices of maternal newborn undernutrition, such as maternal height, birth weight, intrauterine growth restriction, and height, weight, and body mass index at 2 years, and their relationship to outcomes such as height, schooling, wealth, body mass index, glucose concentrations, blood pressure, and offspring birth weight. While our cohorts are all in the global south, there are substantial differences between them. In terms of the time periods they cover, India and Guatemala started in 1969, Brazil and Philippines in 1982 and 83, and respectively, and ours in 1990. The economic classifications also vary, being at the time low and low middle income, as well as their progress through nutritional and health transitions. The range of values and exposures of outcomes amongst the cohorts is also very wide. Mothers and children are shortest in Guatemala, birth weight is lowest in India, and stunting highest in Guatemala, India, and the Philippines. But all 5 are prospective rather than retrospective in design, and thus have the possibility of identifying antecedents of adult health and well-being. Now, despite these variations, we find remarkably consistent association between the sites, between maternal height, child nutrition, and adult outcomes. Our results show that maternal height is strongly associated with a child's birth weight, the prevalence of intrauterine growth restriction, and child weight and height at 2 years. The strongest prediction at that time of our analysis of attained schooling was weight and height at 2 years of age, increasing by as much as half a school year with a unit increase in maternal height. We also reported positive associations between early growth and income or assets, only ever reported before in Finland, with its amazing capacity for long-term follow-up of individuals. Early growth indicators at 2 years of age were also associated with BMI, or body mass index, although we had less certain relationships with glucose concentrations and blood pressure. But the very, very the long-range effects of poor nutrition and growth early in life are illustrated by the positive relationship between a woman's birth weight and the birth weights of her grandchildren, which we're able to demonstrate in our studies. In summary, we provided strong evidence in this paper and in subsequent cohorts publications that adequate nutrition in utero and in the first 2 years of life is strongly related to human capital development. Undernourished mothers living in poor circumstances are likely to have undernourished children who are more likely to become short adults, have lower educational achievement, be economically poorer, and in turn give birth to smaller children of their own. Now, some evolutionary perspectives hold that poor growth in childhood is adaptive, and it's true that there is evidence that physiological sparing is a survival strategy. However, in environmentally deprived conditions, the evidence that early growth failure has huge costs across the life course is overwhelming. More than 25 cohorts papers, in addition to publications from the individual sites, have helped to make the prevention of undernutrition a priority of national health, education, and economic developments in low and middle income countries. But we have made significant contributions to 2 other related topics. The first is the consequences of what is called catch-up growth and what the specific role of early nutrition is in human capital development. Now, catch-up growth refers to a rapid increase in growth rate and size occurring after a period of growth retardation like stunting. Some studies conducted in high-income countries suggest that rapid weight gain in the early life increases the risk of obesity and insulin resistance in later life. We examined these potential trade-offs of different early growth patterns and found that birth weight and faster weight gain in the first 2 years of life had no relationship to adult cardiometabolic risk factors. However, faster mid-childhood weight gain was associated with increased risk of elevated blood pressure and glycemic instability in adulthood. So, in sum, our findings suggest that interventions to increase birth weight and linear growth during the first 2 years of life are likely to result in substantial gains in height, schooling, and IQ, all key indicators of human development, with no or negligible trade-offs for chronic disease. But consistent with a growing body of research, our results indicate that faster weight gain after the age of 2 years has little benefit for human capital development and could lead to large adverse effects on later cardiovascular risk. The seeming specificity of the first 1,000 days is also supported by our findings regarding catch-up growth and cognition. Stunting is strongly related to cognitive development. But our findings show that children who are stunted at 2 years, who subsequently experience catch-up growth, on average do not catch up cognitively. That is, improving growth does not necessarily improve cognitive development, at least in our context. Stunting is the result of multiple interacting factors at different levels, including nutritional deficiencies, impaired absorption due to recurrent infections, household hygiene and child feeding practices, water and sanitation, food security, and so on. However, it is a very significant, easily identifiable problem given its association with later adult human capital. And ashamedly, stunting rates in South Africa remained at roughly 27% of all children under 5 for 40 years, unchanging. The many studies that find that stunting predicts childhood cognitive development seldom take account of social conditions related to both stunting and cognition, leading to an almost exclusive focus on nutrition interventions. However, the longest follow-up of a nutrition and child stimulation intervention, which took place in Jamaica among stunted children, found that nutrition effects washed out in adolescence and only endured when paired with stimulation, resulting in a significant effect on adult income. In cohorts, we have simultaneously assessed the roles of both biological and social conditions and their effect on early childhood cognition. We used maternal height and 3 factors: birth endowment, household resources, and parental capacity, to estimate cognitive performance at 5 years of age. We find that each of these factors play a strong role, but at different points in development. Maternal height and birth endowment have the major influence on birth weight, household resources on child growth at 2 years, and parental capacity on cognitive development when children are 5 years old. We interpret these results as indicating that improving children's cognitive functioning cannot be achieved by nutrition interventions alone, directed at reducing stunting. No single intervention provides all the support necessary for the needs of a young child's unfolding development over time. All are necessary but not sufficient. Rather, we require multi-sectoral efforts to improve parental education and enhance their economic well-being, both of which are also known to improve childhood growth. Of course, there's still a lot to disentangle. Much of what we cannot do with birth to 30 data. In our papers, we conceptualize parental capacity and household resources separately as the education and the economic capital available to children. In many studies, these are run together as traditional socioeconomic status. Economic capital is directly convertible to money, whereas the embodiment of cultural capital in a family, referred to in sociology as habitus, confers educational advantage on children through values and behaviors that promote learning, including through exposure to reading, child-directed speech, encouragement and praise for cognitive gains, and educational aspirations. We need much better understanding of what aspects of cultural capital, which we operationalized in our study as parental education, makes the greatest difference to children's cognitive development. There are just too few studies from low and middle income countries providing the level of detail necessary. In Birth to 30, the focus on the earliest years of life has expanded into life course studies, in which we're beginning to track trajectories of change in order to understand how outcomes and determinants interact, playing interchangeable roles over time and circumstances. For example, how the timing and tempo of puberty, early versus late, slow versus fast, interacts with height and weight and mental health into late adolescence and adulthood. We continue to take this work forward, but what can we say briefly about birth to 30 children and their families over the last 30 years? Birth to 30 provides a baseline for urban children's biological, environmental, socioeconomic, and psychological experiences prior to South Africa's democratic transition. And it enables us to examine whether and how much the extreme hardships experienced during apartheid continued into the next generation who are growing up in a free society. Many laws and policies prioritizing human development were enacted post-1994 to try and level the playing fields. Public expenditure on health, schooling, and social development increased rapidly and is currently by far the largest component of our national budget. So what has been some of the effects on birth to 30 children and their families? Urbanization has been extremely rapid, and in 2000, when we did a sweep of every school in this area, half of the 10-year-old children in Soweto, Johannesburg were immigrants to the city. I mentioned that children and families are highly mobile and have a wide choice of public and private schools that enable them to educate their children to the best of their purse. All the families live within 2 kilometers of a clinic. Bearing in mind that Soweto, Johannesburg is the economic hub of the country and thus not representative of many poorer, informal and rural areas, most houses, apart from ever-expanding shack settlements on the outskirts, have indoor running water and at least an outdoor household toilet. That was at least before our infrastructure started to crumble to the extent that it has. In contrast to the meagerly furnished houses in which many of the birth to 30 children were born, 92% of the cohort live in a home with a refrigerator and a television, 88% have a mobile phone, 71% a washing machine, and close to 60% a computer. However, at age 28, about half of the cohort, both men and women, are dependent on and live with their family, not yet having the means to support themselves through any kind of income. Life is certainly materially better for permanent residents of Soweto and Johannesburg. Women in birth to 30 are, on average, taller by a centimetre than their mothers. More live with their male partners, and more delaying childbirth into their late 20s. Close to 80% of our female cohort members have completed secondary school, as compared to 33% of their mothers. In the latter respect, women are doing substantially better than their male counterparts. Girls repeat classes much less than boys do, and only 63% of our male cohort actually completed high school, compared to 80%. However, more female cohort members are HIV positive, overweight, pre-hypertensive, and pre-diabetic. The age of menarche has declined by a year in the 3 decades of their lives, to 12.5 years. More women than men reported experiencing psychological distress, while men were more likely to abuse substances and engage in criminal activities. Interpersonal violence between men and women, both as perpetrator and victim, occurs in more than half of all intimate relationships. Now, we have long known that height is a sensitive indicator of the conditions of a society. Children and adults grow at a rate and to a stature possible under the conditions of their lives. We have tracked growth and noted marked variations between individuals and between groups. Individual variations seldom predict outcomes. However, average group differences do. Over the course of the study, we find that the centimetre height of white males and females are at par and above the WHO, the World Health Organization standard, while black youth are significantly below. Their height deficit decreases rapidly to 2 years of age, the peak age of stunting, and only partially catches up, especially among boys. So birth to 30 tells the story of improvements in the lives of children, most disadvantaged by apartheid. But what improvements have occurred are as yet insufficient to enable them to catch up with their white counterparts. One of my favorite cohort studies, probably because I share many academic interests with its lead investigator, George Vaillant, is the Harvard study of adult development. The project enrolled 268 students in 1938 during the Great Depression in America and has followed them up for nearly 80 years to understand what factors contribute to a healthy and happy life. One of these students was John F. Kennedy, President of the United States from 61 to 63. Over time, the study expanded to include the children of the original sample, now in their 50s and 60s, as well as the wives of surviving men. Vaillant and successive directors have continued to reflect on findings from the Harvard study, always emphasizing the importance of social bonds. He is quoted as saying that the warmth of relationships we enjoy has the greatest positive impact on life satisfaction. When we have warm relationships with our parents, spouses, friends, and family, we experience less daily anxiety and a greater sense of overall pleasure. We have better health, including lower levels of dementia later in life. We're more effective at work and make more money. Elsewhere, he asserted, happiness is love, full stop. My interviews with the cohort lead me to some similar conclusions, and I wish I had such a confident and pithy conclusion to offer, but I don't. Mandela's children are 33 years old. Most have the longest part of their lives ahead of them. A lot could still happen, and the life of each one could change substantially for the better, I hope, or for the worse. If I've learnt one thing from Birth 30, it is this. When one asks a question or takes a measurement in a cross-sectional study, it's easy to be confident that one has uncovered a fact about a human being. When one repeats the measure 2 to 3 years later, questions of construct validity and measurement reliability are raised. When one repeats measures 3 or more times, one comes to a much more profound conclusion that I found beautifully described by Christopher Fuchs, a quantum physicist and prior STIAS fellow. He writes, and I quote, "When you make a measurement, for example on a subatomic particle or a quantum computer, the process of measurement participates, and this is an important word, participates, in bringing about the actual value. We are accustomed to thinking that accurate measurements only reveal what is already there. For instance, I'd like to know how wide this desk is, so I pick up a ruler and find it's exactly 1 meter. The common perception is that I have found it was 1 meter because it was 1 meter in actual fact. But in the quantum mechanical world, things don't have pre-existing properties like length. The thing obtains a value for me when I make the effort to measure it. How much more true of human lives through time." Thank you very much.
Linda, thank you very, very much for that. I don't have to repeat anything of why this is significant and important and wonderful to listen to. So I'd like us to get straight into some questions and comments. Before we do that, let me just acknowledge also from my side those online who joined us, many STIAS fellows. You mentioned Shane Norris, but also several others that I've seen, as well as guests from others from Stellenbosch University here, from Wits, and from several other universities across the country and public in general. So welcome to all of you. And let me immediately add that I apologize that we won't be able to take any questions from those online, but please do use the chat function in MS Teams. We'll collect all your comments online and make sure that Linda receives them. So let's take any comments and questions from the floor here then. I saw in the red right at the back first.
Firstly, thank you so very much. I find your study incredibly urgent and important, although it's been 30 years already. I was just wondering if there is any suggestion that something like this can be done countrywide, that there are other areas that are being investigated, if we can actually get this research going as a continuous longitudinal study at national level?
Do you want to talk more than one or? Yes, thanks very much. Indeed, there are other longitudinal studies. The Drockenstein study, which is conducted out of the UCT Department of Psychiatry, and I very much hope they will. That also started at birth, and I very much hope that they'll be able to continue beyond. I think they're in the early adolescence. Perhaps I can be corrected. We also did have a national longitudinal study called the National Income Dynamics Study, which, in contrast to many other studies, was actually tracking individuals within households over time. We managed 4 rounds of that before funding from the National Treasury was cut. And this is the biggest disadvantage of longitudinal studies. Many people who have undertaken them have said, you know, it's a wonderful idea, but I'd never do it myself. It's like organizing an international conference. Let somebody else do it, because these studies are enormously expensive. We have suffered 40% attrition over these 30 years. Granted, most of this attrition was in the early years, and once children got into school, we've been pretty much able to keep the cohort without much attrition. But if you tried this nationally, given that mobility is actually the most basic coping strategies of families, and families are not restricted to one household. Families occupy several households, and those several households are spatially separated, and people move between them in order to cope with whatever exigencies are happening in their lives. So I think a national study would be extremely challenging in our environment. The study in Pelotas is in a single city, which is where we got our inspiration from. The one in Cebu is on a single island, which was a very good idea. Guatemala was in several spaced villages, and they've recently been funded to look for participants in Miami, for example, people who've left Guatemala too. But attrition is really the major problem, and of course, attrition is not random. The people who leave studies leave either because they are privileged in some way, they move away, they move overseas, they move to other cities, or they are somewhat very disadvantaged. For example, one young man who I was going to interview for the book, his mother phoned me a couple of days before we were due to meet. And she said, I'm very sorry that you won't be able to meet with my son, but he's just been sentenced to 40 years imprisonment. So the people that you lose are not random. So you have to consider that this is really a problem that you have to deal with throughout the study.
Thank you. I saw a hand. Yes.
Thank you so much, Prof, for that wonderful summary of the incredible work that you've been doing. I had a similar question, so I'll ask another question now. How did you manage to minimize the level of attrition in the study, given the mobility that you described? And another question related to that is, the COVID pandemic was a crisis world over. Have you had a chance to assess how this pandemic affected, in particular, your sample, your participants who generally are vulnerable to such circumstances? Thank you.
The COVID epidemic?
Yes.
Okay. So we've done a huge amount to, and you know, Shane is not only a PhD level physiologist, he went and got an MBA in business in order to manage the study. So he very purposely set up many mechanisms for tracking people, this outreach through our vehicles and so on, but also birthday cards, notices in newspapers, articles in newspapers and on the radio so that people knew something was happening in the study, tracking people, collecting phone numbers of friends, aunties, relatives, so that we would always, and every data collection year is a whole exploration to try and find people. So that is, you know, I think we've more or less managed to cope with attrition post 5 years of age. And we have some circular attrition. So people, in some years we were collecting data twice a year, particularly in early adolescence, because we were interested in sexual debut, HIV infection, and so on. And so somebody would miss the 13-and-a-half-year round, but we'd find them in the 15-year round. So we've also had to compensate for that with various statistical techniques of combining age ranges and questionnaires across age. COVID, we last saw the cohort in 2018, so before cohort. Now, in the interim, we've all been applying for grants to be able to continue to see the cohort. And so a lot hinges on Shane's put in a big application. For now, we've never done interventions in birth to 30, but it's actually becoming extremely hard in the world to justify a purely descriptive study. So Shane is applying for an intervention cohort, where the cohort will be divided in half across risk for hypertension. So, and then there'll be an intervention. So we're waiting for the outcome, and we can't hear Shane on the line, but he'll let me know as soon as he knows the outcome.
Thank you. Shane, if you know the answer, you're welcome to post it. I'll repeat it. Okay, good luck with that. I saw Pumla next, and please, anyone else, I'll note your name.
Thank you so much, Linda. I told my postdoc fellows, some of them, that to encourage them to stay with you after you've visited, that Linda is a national treasure when it comes to scholarship. So I am so glad that you've really presented this work, which shows us that you are indeed a national treasure for us. I was very intrigued by the relationship between the blood lead levels and violence. And it made me wonder whether there might be a collaboration with your study in the area of research on violence, you know, on understanding violence, because we've seen in recent years, increasingly, the violence becoming just gratuitous, you know, almost like the person has to kill and kill again, you know, the killing and the, you know, the violation of the body. And I wonder, you know, whether this work might be a site as well for deepening the research on violence, and I wonder what your views on that is.
Right, so Sarah here in the front row is really, her PhD has been on adverse childhood experiences, but of course violence permeates the lives of these children. Mareka was explaining that she'd just recently been in Germany and mentioned this figure that 1% only of this cohort had not experienced or witnessed violence, not heard gunshots, not seen somebody being punched, not seen somebody have a knife pulled on them or something like that. And so the work on lead levels was conducted by Angie Mathie and two of her PhD students at the Medical Research Council. And I have recently written to her, funnily enough, to ask her whether she wanted to collaborate further, given this unique data, because they have umbilical cord blood, meaning we know what babies were born with, and they also measured blood lead levels in adolescents. But it is a finding from all over the world that there's this relationship to aggression. I think we hadn't found so much of the fact that lead levels are so much higher amongst boys than girls. So we have this confounding effect of sex on the thing. But Sarah, this is up to you. You're like the next generation.
Thank you. I saw 3 hands on this side with the black coat, and then the white cream coat, and then Michael.
Thank you very much, Linda. Very fascinating overview of your great body of work. I just want to latch on to one of your comments where you mentioned multiple interventions being required. And to really tackle this problem, you know, this is my sense too, also from some of the things that we've been doing. What do you think, what are the most important combinations to lever changes with at small cost? If you just have to think of the most effective combinations of interventions that could really be effective to shift the dial.
So there is, you know, there's a whole new design of randomizing at different time points. And so the Healthy Lives Trajectory Initiative study randomized at pregnancy, randomized post-birth, and is going to randomize again after the early childhood intervention. So that's the kind of design we should be thinking of. As Elmarie Malik knows, when people ask me, like, how do you do something, I always say, for South Africans, the word is pak padkos. It means food for the road, because all of this takes a long time. So for many, many decades, we've been banging the drum about stunting. And unfortunately, it's now been taken up, and everybody thinks, well, we talk about stunting at 5. Well, stunting at 5 doesn't mean anything. Children have caught up by 5. Catch-up growth is quite rapid between 2 and 5 years. Giving nutrition at 5 is not going to do very much, and giving a micronutrient at 5 is not going to do very much at all. The real interventions have to happen in pregnancy and pre-pregnancy. So if I had to say what is the ideal timing, I would say we need nutrition interventions for pregnant women and the first 6 months of a child's life. And, exclusive breastfeeding is really what we have to be promoting. From birth onwards, it's financial interventions. And we do have a child support grant that is now down to birth. And if we could get it a bit earlier so that women had it during the last phase of pregnancy, and then from birth onwards, we need to ensure that children are being cognitively stimulated. Given the neurological facts of the billions of neurons being laid down, given the fact that there's this massive boom, it's talked about as a synaptic explosion in the brain in the last trimester of pregnancy and early postnatal. If this is not taken up, if an opportunity is not taken to enable babies to acquire information, which is what they're programmed to do, they're programmed to become little human beings, to just latch onto the human cultural world, the language, the meaning, communication, it is lost. So I would say we have to make sure that we begin with the nutrition interventions, ensure the economic interventions, and then make sure that children are getting the stimulation that they need to grow cognitively.
In the cream coat.
Hi, Linda, and thank you so much. Lots of respect to you. So, our national nutrition surveys, can I ask your opinion on that? Cross-sectional studies, 5 or longer years apart. How do you think we should be thinking about those surveys, and do you suggest any design changes to that? Do you think they are still valuable?
Talking about the San-Haynes?
Yes, and the demographic and health survey that has some nutrition indicators attached to it.
Well, as you probably know, because you know the Demographic and Health Survey and the South African National Health and Nutrition Survey, we don't know anything about breastfeeding rates because the two surveys ask the questions differently. So now, if you asked me what are breastfeeding rates in South Africa, they would be estimates from small-scale studies. I don't remember how growth was measured in both of them and whether it was measured at 2 or 5. But if it was measured at 5, it really wouldn't be of much use to us. You get growth normalizing out by 5 years of age. It's really got to be measured between 1 and 2 years, or 2 years at the very latest, to be sensitive to stunting. But again, just focusing on stunting tells us the deprivations that have historically occurred. They're not telling us how to fix this problem, because Daniela Cassell's work using our data clearly shows that children who have experienced catch-up growth do not catch up cognitively. They catch up in the ordinary skills of life. So remember, in the results she found, children who had catch-up growth could do the kind of ordinary things that most children can do adaptively. They can button their shirts, they can climb steps and everything. So they look pretty normal to everybody. But when they're asked to do cognitive tasks, copy shapes, explain words, or do anything that's more cognitive rather than adaptive, they hadn't caught up at all. So the focus on stunting, I mean, we shouldn't lose the focus, because it is telling us our children are being born with enormous disadvantages. That, you don't get stunting just because you don't have enough food in the house. You become stunted for lots of reasons: the infectious rates, the availability of clean water and sanitation, all of those things. So we know we have to stop that, but it can't be our measure of how we're going to go forward, is my view.
Thank you. Michael was next, and then...
Thanks, Linda. So I was listening to this as a biologist, and in my head I was thinking about how I've listened to many studies like this about animals. Like my colleagues work on these birds called superb fairy wrens, and they've just celebrated their 30th year of a long-term study as well. So it was funny to see the parallels. So my question is, when I'm listening to my colleagues who do those kind of studies, I immediately put on my cynical hat and go, correlation is not causation. When you make these statements about we saw this and it's then predicted this subsequently, I always go, well, can you do an experiment? And if you can't do an experiment, is there a natural experiment that's happened in your data, something external that's happened? Do you have anything like that? I know experiments is difficult because randomized controls, very difficult to get those passed, unfortunately, even though the only way to do decent policy. But do you have any natural experiments in your data set?
People in the audience have searched for those natural experiments. We went through a long period of interrogation. Was there some external shock, for example? The schools, the unrest at schools in Soweto. People who were exposed to the unrest and people who had not been exposed. I don't know if we still want to pursue this, but it is extremely difficult in human-like affairs to find these perfectly natural experiments. And I don't think that randomized controlled trials, they're so limited by context that they tell you. We had this discussion about Michael Kramer's work on education in East Africa. And one of his surprising findings was that in one area, putting in a concrete floor in the schools, in the classrooms, actually boosted achievement. And the reason was because in that particular area, children had high rates of worms. And so putting in concrete floors just kind of reduced the load of parasites, and which enabled children to have more energy, to concentrate more, so on and so forth. So I'm very skeptical, having come from an experimental psychology background, and I always say psychologists invented experiments, not agriculturalists. I'm now very skeptical about randomized controlled trials.
Okay. Thanks, Michael. Yes. In the front of the blue.
Oh, except the rollouts, like we were talking about Bolsa Familias and Oportunidades in Brazil and Mexico, where you have the opportunity to do rollout. I'm sorry, I'm not talking into the mic. South Africa has a lot of antipathy towards evaluating rollouts. In a country with so much inequality, equity is like a sacred principle. So when we did suggest a series of experiments to raise the child support grant in certain areas and look at the effects, there was really absolutely no interest in giving some people something more than others. It's just against the grain.
Thanks, Linda, very much for a wonderful talk again and for all the work you've done, and also to advise us here in the Western Cape on the First 1,000 Days initiative. I wondered whether you want to say a little bit more about responsive caregiving, because I think you alluded to it in the very important notion around brain infrastructure, the neuronal synapses and connections and stimulation of children. But perhaps just to comment a little bit more on the very young child and the mental, relational aspects that I think are worth mentioning. Thanks.
So Elle-Marie's raising another, my life is divided into two. The one is this kind of interest in epidemiological studies, and the other is in very intensive mother-infant interaction. And I've done 3 longish term video recorded studies of mothers and babies together, really looking at kind of origins of early communication and understanding. And there is a substantial body of work on this around the world, which has led us to understand that the human brain responds particularly to contingency. So babies, some developmental psychologists have talked about this as the serve and return principle. The baby does something, coughs, and the mother goes, "Oh, you're coughing. you're coughing. And babies smile and they'll cough again, or they'll laugh, and the mother will say, oh, it's funny, my baby, it's so funny. And these interactions, which are called proto-conversations, way before children start to say any understandable words, are very well developed from about 5 months of age up to when communicative gestures become well understood, like waving goodbye and so on. And neurologists and psychologists believe it is these contingent, what we call responsive, interactions between adults and babies, or even between children and babies, that are the driving force of this purposeful synaptic development, that is fine-tuning. The baby's task is to become a human being. It's not to do anything mechanical, it is to become a human being. And Colwyn Trevarthen described what he called instincts. And he was talking about this in the 1970s and 80s when instincts were long out the window. But he began to say, like Bowlby and others, about faculties of the brain. The baby's brain is not purposeless. There are purposeful potentials built into the baby's brain. And one of those potentials is this potential to relate to other people in a meaningful way. It's shown from the beginning of birth, because babies are born often in busy operating theatres, lots of lights and lots of things going on. And if you track their eye movement moves absolutely specifically to a human being and specifically to eye contact with that human being. If they put on the mother's chest, the baby will make elementary crawling and pulling movements to get to the breast. If in the 2 or 3 days after birth, somebody makes exaggerated mouth movements to the baby, like stick out their tongue or open their mouth wide, babies imitate. They have these mirror mechanisms that are built into the human brain that become the fundamental substrate of this very significant mother-infant interaction. Now, Elmarie is referring to the fact that these principles have been put into guidelines at the level of the World Health Organization and other places, where when mothers make visits to health clinics, health workers can very simply encourage, praise moms, help them to be responsive in these ways, sometimes just by doing it themselves and then encouraging the mother to do it, and then the baby's natural response is often something that generates the next piece of the response and so on. But, you know, when I talk about this very early cognitive development, there's a baby here today, which I'm very glad about. If in psychoanalysis, and somebody was talking at the conference this morning about how the deep structures of psychoanalysis, how valuable they are to us in our psychology. So there is a therapeutic technique which is simply to gaze at the baby, to engage just visually with the baby. And to be quiet, not to try and prompt the baby to do anything, just to engage with the gaze and try to imagine what the baby is thinking and feeling. Now, the baby's probably not thinking anything, but the point is the mechanism of projection to the baby is a very important behavioral motivation in the parent. The idea that the baby is thinking, is feeling, is wanting something. So the Western Cape has really done an enormous amount to build this responsive caregiving into the early delivery of healthcare for mothers in a supportive, kind of encouraging way. It's not teaching mothers to do anything. That we understand that all human beings have this capacity. We see this when anybody approaches a baby, old people, children, they all change the register of their speech. They talk in this high-pitched, lilting way. Hello, what are you saying? So that we have these instinctive parental behaviors. And so they need to be encouraged. And when I talk about 40% of women are depressed people are completely inner directed. So when a mother is depressed, she's not alert to this in her baby. She needs support, she needs help, she needs someone that gives her the same kind of caring, responsive caregiving that will enable her to be able to see her baby and see the needs. So thanks, Elmarie. I didn't want to pretend that this part doesn't exist. It's very strong, yeah.
Thank you, Elmarie. We have time for perhaps one more comment, question. Let's go to...
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. I've coordinated the extended degree program at Stellenbosch University for the last 13 years. And I must say I'm a bit desperate listening to you, because one of the main motivators for us, for these students who come from desperate circumstances, is exactly to try and motivate them that their biology is not their destiny, you know, and that with a growth mindset and hard work, they can overcome their biology and their circumstances. So, yeah, I'm really a bit discouraged in that sense, you know. If you say to these students, well, I'm afraid you didn't develop properly, so your chances are not very good of achieving success.
I always give the example of the two most famous scholars on early childhood growth are very short men. One is almost a midget from Guatemala, and the other's a very short Brazilian. Individual backgrounds count very little in terms of predicting anything. I hope I made that clear. Group statistics make some sense, but they are approximations. There's a whole part of the curve that's left out of that. You know, when we say there's a strong correlation, we like 40% or 30%. In social sciences, we think that's strong. But that means 60 or 70% don't have that relationship. So I don't think that, you know, there's all these funny sayings like it's never too late to have a happy childhood and so on. Of course, many of our students, and I often give my own story as a way of saying that, you know, you can escape your background, and it's not easy. I came from a family in which neither of my parents had finished secondary school, lived in a small mining community. They obviously did all the right things, the habitus things, encouraged learning, read to me and did all those things, and we were all very eager young learners. But when I went to university, I felt a terrible inadequacy. I was at university with friends whose parents were mathematics professors or history professors. I felt like there was a whole empty part of my background. And I know that that's what those students principally feel, that their background is like being a hollow person. There's just a whole lot of stuff that they didn't get. And we need to be much more sensitive to trying to help them find that, which is why I'm so sorry that we've lost the more pastoral aspect of tertiary education. When I was a student, I went into an honours class. There were only 3 of us. We spent enormous time with our lecturers. We went to cocktail parties with them. We drank too much wine with them. We learned what it was to be in this different world. Now we're teaching students, 900 students in first year psychology, 150 in honours. It's very hard to make up that hollow place now. So, yeah.
Thank you. There was quite a bit of a discussion online. I'm just going to raise one issue that was brought up initially by a colleague of yours at Wits, Sudeshni Naidu. And the question was, and it was picked up by our wonderful fellow Habib Benzian from last semester. The question of whether dental and oral dental health had been at any point considered as an indicator to measure.
No, definitely. There were a whole lot of papers by Peter Cleaton-Jones, who was the professor of dentistry at Wits at the time, on dental health. It's just not an area I'm very familiar with, so I haven't spoken about it. And certainly dental health was tracked right through to about age of 10 years. So I would just say, please go and look at the papers of Jenny McEwen and Peter Cleaton-Jones, and you'll find a really rich history of work on dental health in the study.
Leslie, your wonderful introduction sang the praises of Linda, and I think, Linda, the way that you presented your work really demonstrates all of what Leslie described, your love for this work, for science, and your passion for bringing it to us. Thank you very, very much. Thank you for all the inputs. We're...
Thank you. Thank you, Christoph. The very best part of this is that dotted all over this room, including at the back, are people that I have worked with or associated for decades. And we've all been faithful to this cause, so thank you very much.
You're all invited to join us for some refreshments outside. Thanks.